What's the strangest coincidence you've ever personally experienced? Story 1. At my old job, we did a Secret Santa the week before Christmas. The spending limit was $10, and I barely knew the person I was assigned. I procrastinated because I honestly had no idea what to buy her. I was walking through town past a few shops when I noticed an old copy of Oliver Twist sitting in the window of a second-hand bookstore. For some reason, it really stood out to me, so I went inside and picked it up. I flipped to the first page to check the price. Exactly $10. Perfect. On the day of the Secret Santa, about 150 people were opening gifts. Out of the corner of my eye, I noticed a small crowd forming around a woman who was crying. People were asking who her Secret Santa was. I went over and said it was me, as she hugged me and explained that 10 years earlier, her house had burned down, destroying everything she owned. That book had been her favorite, and not just the title, but the exact same edition with the same cover. Because it was secondhand, it was even worn in the same spots she remembered. She said it felt like I had taken it off her shelf before the fire and somehow returned it to her a decade later. Story 2. In my small town in northwest England, there's a kebab shop my friends and I have ordered from for years. We've been there countless times after nights out and had food delivered to our houses, so we know the staff pretty well. Most of them are Turkish. One year, a few of us went on a short holiday to Turkey. After landing, we were standing in the parking lot waiting for another friend whose flight arrived later. As we were taking in the feeling of being in a completely new country, the tall guy from our local kebab shop casually walked across the road right in front of us, 2,000 miles from home. That one really messed with us. Story 3. No one ever believes this, but my husband and I once ran into the same couple 3 separate times across 2 different states in a single day. We left early one morning to run an errand out of state and stopped for breakfast. The couple was sitting across from us, and the woman was wearing a really distinctive shirt, which stuck in my mind. After breakfast, we drove into the next state for an appointment. While waiting in the lobby, the exact same couple walked in. That alone was strange. Later, after finishing everything, we headed home and stopped at a pub for dinner because I didn't feel like cooking. We sat down, and the same couple was already seated at the table behind us. At that point, it felt unreal. Story 4. I was on vacation in St. Jane, Augustine, and on the drive there, I randomly thought about a girl I had known in college in Orlando. I wondered what she was doing these days. Nothing serious. That very first night, I ran into her at a bar. She was there celebrating her graduation from PA school. Something similar happened to me years later. I had dated a guy named Steven in my late 20s. We lived together for a year, broke up, and I was completely heartbroken. Years passed without seeing him. One day, walking through Santa Monica with my best friend, I said, "It's weird how we have so many mutual friends, and I've never run into Steven once." 5 minutes later, we crossed the street, walked into a restaurant, and there he was. Story 5. A friend and I took acid one night and were tripping extremely hard. I decided to walk to a gas station to buy cigarettes or something. On the way, we passed a car lot in my small hometown, and every single car on the lot was a police car. We immediately straightened up, walked silently to the store, calmly bought what we needed, and took a side street back to my friend's place. Once we got there, we just stared at each other for an hour without saying a word. Later, we found out the city had just received an entire new fleet of police cars that night, and they'd all been parked there temporarily. That reminded me of something from my younger, rebellious years. A group of friends and I were in a similar state. One early morning around sunrise and decided to throw a frisbee around at the park. The air felt amazing, the light was beautiful, and we were laughing loudly like no one else existed. Suddenly, about 40 police officers in full SWAT gear appeared. Turns out they were running a planned training exercise at the park. Once it registered, we scattered immediately. Story 6. I was sitting in a restaurant about 200 miles from where I live, telling my mother, who was visiting from another country, about a work trip I'd taken to a country about 6,000 miles away with a colleague. The woman at the table next to us leaned over and said, "I think you're talking about my son." It turned out I was sitting right next to my colleague's parents while showing my mom photos from the trip. Story 7 in grade 10 English. Near the end of the year, our teacher didn't have anything planned. She went to a large cabinet in the corner and pulled out copies of past final exam essays that had scored very well to show us what a strong narrative looked like. The essay topic was, "What was the most pivotal moment of your life?" There were 3 examples of varying quality. We read the first 2, and I volunteered to read the last one aloud. Halfway through, I stopped. My older sister had written it 6 years earlier about the day I was born, and it had earned a top grade. Story 8. I've told this before, but you're all hearing it again. I was at a convention with a friend. There were only a handful of people in the room, and we wanted an autograph from a voice actor. He started singing in character. 2 random guys were standing next to me, and one pulled out a video camera to record it. Years later, my husband and I were talking with friends and that convention came up. The guy with the camera was my husband. I also had a photo from later that day of the crowd, and he was in it. I had stood next to my future husband years before we ever met. Story 9. In the early to mid-90s, phone systems changed so you no longer needed to dial an area code for long-distance calls within the state. Our state only had one area code anyway. One morning I woke up to the phone ringing. When I answered, I instantly recognized the voice. It was my former boss from several years earlier. It had a very distinctive voice. We chatted for a while before she realized she'd dialed the wrong number. I lived in a completely different town, but the number must have been off by just 1 digit. On top of that, I had overslept and would have been late for work if her call hadn't woken me up. Story 10. When I was 18, I lived in a town very far from where I eventually settled. I became friends with a guy from work there. We played Halo, watched movies, and hung out all the time. He was a great friend. I had to move suddenly because of a family emergency and never got his contact info. Over the years, I thought about him often but couldn't even remember his name. 11 years later, I was carpooling with someone from my training class at work. One night, he asked if his roommate could ride along because he needed the car afterward. He introduced us, and sitting in the back seat was the guy from that town. We reconnected instantly. Now we live together. He's my best friend and the godfather to my kids. Story 11. When I was a kid, around 13, I played a lot of a video game called Diablo 2. I started a clan with a few people I'd met on the internet and we played every day. At some point, we were helping some random person and he asked to join. We thought he was nice enough, so we let him in. As part of this clan, we had a shared account we used to store game items for each other. After about a month of playing, this new guy goes in and changes the password, steals the account, and defrauds everyone, completely disappears off the map with all of our stuff. Fast forward a year later, and my family moves to Texas, and it's my first day at school. I'm sitting in algebra class talking to the person in the seat next to me, and he mentions he plays Diablo. I told myself that I ran a clan and everything. I asked his username and it was him. 2,000 miles away from where I first virtually met this guy, he's sitting next to me in math class. When I told him mine, his face went into total shock and he didn't know how to respond. It was awkward for sure. Ended up telling him I didn't care and was over it, but let's just say we didn't end up becoming friends. Story 12. When I was 1 year old, we moved to a city some 500 kilometers away from where I was born. 15 years later, my father decided to put me in a boarding school in the area of that first city, because he went there too. I got randomly put in a room with 2 other guys, one of whom is still my best friend today. When I first visited that friend at his home, I discovered that he not only lives in the same city as we did, not much of a coincidence as it's the only major city in that area, but in the same house. Officer, I couldn't remember our old house, so I called my father to confirm that it's the same address, and it turns out that he very briefly knew my friend's family from selling the house. Story 13. Last summer, I went to New York with my family for a week. A friend of mine that I hadn't seen since she graduated from college was living and working in New York at the time, so we decided to meet up for drinks. As we were walking through Times Square at 11 p.m. on a Saturday, who did we see on the other side of the street but another friend of ours from college? I knew he had been living in New Jersey, but he was in New York for a grinder date. The 3 of us went to a bar and talked about life and how none of our friends live in Ireland anymore. They've all moved abroad. It was bittersweet and a crazy coincidence that 3 friends from a small university in Dublin would accidentally meet in New York City. Story 14. Had recently moved cities and had a new local phone number. I had to make a lot of calls to various utilities, etc. to get everything all set up. I called one of them and spoke with the customer service rep. All was going fine until she asked for my phone number. When I tell her, she starts freaking out on me. Who are you? How did you find me? How do you know that phone number? Kind of stuff. Eventually managed to get her calmed down to the point where we could figure out what was going on. It turned out she had been in an abusive relationship where her ex had stalked and harassed her, including him and his friends making threatening calls constantly. Eventually, she had moved to a different part of the city and taken a new unlisted phone number. My new phone number was her old one, and the moment I said it, she assumed he had tracked her down once again and the harassment campaign was about to begin anew. I'm not sure she truly believed me when I explained it all, but we eventually got through the phone call. Story 15. This happened to my mom about 10 years ago. When she was about 13 years old, she lived on Midway Island with my grandparents because my grandpa was an officer in the Navy. She had a water skiing accident where she basically slammed her face into the sea wall because she didn't let go of the rope in time and had a scar on her forehead that she covered with her bangs. Anyway, fast forward 45 years, and she is working at a retirement facility, and her job is to coordinate outings for residents. There was a new resident, and she was talking to him about his life trying to get to know him. He said he was in the Navy, and my mom thought that was cool since her dad was too. He said he was stationed at Midway Island, which my mom thought was super cool since it's a tiny island, and he said he was there during the same time she was, the 60s. He went on to say he hated it because the only interesting thing that ever happened was when an officer's daughter didn't let go early enough while water skiing and slammed right into the seawall and cracked her head open, and he had to save her. My mom was totally shocked, pulled her bangs to the side to show him the scar, and said I was that officer's daughter. Coolest coincidence ever. Story 16. In freshman physics, I became friends with the Japanese kid next to me. After a while, he was helping me with my Japanese homework. Did really well after that, by the way. But after that class, we kinda drifted apart. Fast forward 2 years where I'm an exchange student in Japan over the summer and doing some sightseeing in Kyoto after the program. I'm crossing the street in Kyoto and I hear my name being called out. I look around and there he is. Thousands of miles apart, we meet again. We got some drinks and good food together. It was a blast. No, his hometown was not Kyoto. He was also doing sightseeing while home for the summer. Story 17. I had recently graduated from a large state school and found a room in an empty house to rent. Since I was moving from my college apartment, I didn't have furniture, and I decided to grab a dresser a previous occupant had left in the basement. It wasn't anything crazy looking, but it wasn't a basic mass-produced IKEA dresser either. Something a bit older, but not antique. 3 of my friends helped me move it upstairs while we were waiting for a fourth. The fourth friend arrives, walks into my room, and stares at my dresser for a long time before saying, "Why do you have my dresser?" It turns out her parents had donated her childhood dresser to Goodwill, and the previous occupant of the house was from the same tiny town she was and had got his dresser at that Goodwill. Story 18. My partner and I were looking for a car. We wanted a Subaru Impreza and found one for our price range on our street that had my 3-letter initials for its license plate. The seller was a high school friend of my partner. This reminds me of mine. My friends and I were doing a cross-country road trip. We were driving through the middle of nowhere, somewhere in the Midwest, and we made friends with this Subaru next to us. We had a whiteboard and were communicating with them, laughing and crap for probably 2 hours. Anyway, after some time, they pull off another direction, and we keep driving for a few hours before stopping to get lunch. We eat some lunch and hop back onto the freeway. We were near some city, so there was a ton of traffic and were having trouble merging. The people that finally let us in were no other than the exact same couple in the Subaru. Story 19. When I was in university in Toronto, I was flying to England for a debating tournament. I booked my flight, then told my partner the date and time of the flight so he could book as well. The day before we left, we agreed to meet at a particular subway station and go to the end of the line to catch the bus to the airport. The next day, I go to the subway station at the agreed time, but he doesn't show up pre-cell phone days, so I can't call him. Eventually I have to go, so I take the subway or bus, get to the airport and go to the gate, but there's no sign of him. I have him paged over the loudspeaker, no result. I tell this story to the gate agent who looks up the passenger list. He's not on it. Confused, I flew to London. I did find him the next day in London, which is another story all its own, almost as coincidental. It turned out that while I was on one level of the subway station waiting to travel north to catch a bus to Terminal 1 at the airport for my flight, he was on the other level of the same station, waiting to travel west to catch a bus to Terminal 2 for his flight, which was at exactly the same time on the same day, but on a different airline. At every step of the way, we had been describing identical routes, but without ever having any overlap. In story 20, my dad passed away last summer. While I was making calls letting the rest of the family know the bad news, I ran across the number of one of my dad's childhood friends, whom he kept in contact with throughout the years. The number must have been old and disconnected because I couldn't get in touch with him. I was severely disappointed that my dad's best friend and probably one of his only friends wouldn't be able to make it to the funeral, so I attempted to reach out to him through anyone that might have known how to contact him. No luck. Days go by and my dad's funeral day comes. After the service on the way from the funeral home to the cemetery, I got a call through my dad's phone. It was his friend calling to say that he was coming into the state headed to our house for a visit, and he just wanted to make sure that my father would be available. It absolutely shook my world. I told him that he passed away a couple of days prior and that he had just missed the funeral and we were currently at the cemetery. He met my mother and I a couple hours later and said his final goodbyes to my father. I'll never get over how he happened to be on his way down for a visit on the day of my dad's funeral, but I'm glad he was able to make it to send my dad off. Story 21. For over a decade, I very rarely remembered any of my dreams. One night, I had a very vivid dream that I was busted by the cops for drug possession and was sentenced to prison. The dream itself was agonizingly paced as if in real time. Days turned to weeks, to months. The pain of losing everything and everyone in my life had sent me into catatonic despair when all of a sudden I awoke. I instinctually checked my phone, only to find a ton of missed texts, emails, and phone calls from a friend who was arrested for drugs that night while I slept and had been trying to get me to bail him out. Story 22. My favorites occurred during separate canoe trips. The first was during a Labor Day weekend trip up and down the St. June Day. Poise River, 2 days paddling upstream, one down, which runs between Wisconsin and Minnesota and eventually joins the Mississippi River. Despite it being a holiday weekend, there was virtually no traffic on the river, as we saw only one other boat, and that was on the first day shortly after we left. On the second day out, the weather was quite warm. At one point, I said, "Boy, a watermelon sure would be good right about now." My 3 companions told me to shut up and not even mention it, because we didn't have one and weren't going to find one in the wilderness. A little while later, we spotted a green object floating toward us that turned out to be a watermelon. Years later, I was on a river outing with several other people on the Whitewater River in Indiana. I was paddling my kayak and had just told the watermelon story to the people in the canoe next to me. It was a hot summer day, and someone said something to the effect of, "Watermelons are fine, but I could really go for a cold beer right now." A few minutes later, we paddled around a bend and saw a cooler sitting on a sandbar. We stopped on the sandbar, opened the cooler, and found that it contained just enough cold beers for each of us to have one. Appalachian Trail hikers refer to occurrences like this as trail magic. I guess it happens on rivers too. Story 23. I got a new computer and was scrolling through pictures on the old one with my little brother. I had a picture of 2 butterflies, one blue and one yellow, on a large purple flower. I loved this picture and always thought how lucky I was to get it. The colors were so vivid and the butterflies too patient to let me get 3 shots in before they flew away. My brother was in awe of it, and I said, "Wow, you really like this one?" He pulled out his phone and said, "No, I took this photo." Sure enough, he had been to the same park the summer after I took my picture. He had the same species of plant and butterflies in the same park and around the same area and time of day.
What are the chances this was years ago?
I'll have to see if he still has his, and I'll try posting them later. Story 24. I knew a girl in high school that was just the worst type of person. It takes too long to explain all the reasons, but a big one is that she tried to drive a wedge between my bestie and I. She moved away after high school. My friend and I would bring her up occasionally and talk about some of her worst qualities, and say how glad we were that we never had to see her again. One time, as we were doing so in a restaurant, suddenly she appeared right next to our table. She'd come back to visit someone and just happened to be right where we were right as we were discussing her. So awkward. It was 5 minutes of awkwardness, and then she left and we just sat there like, the hell. Story 25. A few years ago, I spontaneously decided I was going to go on a camping trip for a blood moon eclipse by myself. I had 0 camping experience, so me deciding to do this was random enough as it was. I asked around for good spots, ended up being suggested one of the small lakes in the Adirondacks, and off I went. The night of the blood moon eclipse, I went to a nearby bridge way before it was even nighttime to make sure I had a good spot. I stayed there the entire night. Lots of people came and stayed, but there were also a lot of people who just pulled over for a minute or two to look at the eclipse and then just went on their way. Fast forward a couple months, I'm telling one of my longtime friends who I always had a crush on about my adventures when he came home from college. He pauses for a moment and just says, "I know that bridge. Just past the town, over the river?" Turns out he had happened to be driving through that night and pulled over at that same exact spot, but he had been on the opposite side of the road. It was crazy. It felt like a really cool fairy tale type thing when we started dating afterward. But then he turned out to be a psycho, and it just became a waste of a plot point. Blame. Story 26. Starting college after the army, and when I'm getting my college ID pic taken, they're doing a story on the new college IDs. 2 days later, my ID mugshot pic is on the bottom of the front page for their story. 3 years of straight quarters and a couple of major changes, I've tapped out my GI Bill benefits. So I transferred to another school where I have a better shot at getting employment while working. Go through registration, and my new school happens to be doing a story on their new ID cards, and guess who gets on the front page of his new school paper? And my 15 milliseconds of fame, but mom was proud. Story 27. When I started hanging out with my girlfriend, she invited me over to her house, and it's the first house I ever lived in. Her grandmother, who lives down the street, was friends with my parents. She worked for a doctor who delivered me. Fast forward a little bit, and we're sitting around looking at some of our old family pictures, and there's this one of a 4th of July parade in my neighborhood. There was a little boy in the picture that they didn't really know who it was, but it looked an awful lot like me. I asked my dad, and he remembers that day where he took us to our old street to watch the parade. When I was a toddler, I wandered into my future girlfriend's family picture. Story 28. How I met my husband. So you know how they say you won't find someone until you stop looking? On the way to the club with my cousin, I said, I don't want to look for a guy tonight. I just wanted to have fun. I had a bout of bad luck in that department. Anyways, we are dancing and hanging out. We go outside and I go have a smoke. I remember I was talking to a guy friend. I was looking around and then I saw him. He was standing by a guy who I knew was friends with my cousin. I don't know how to explain it, but it was I have to go talk to him. I never went and talked to guys because I was too shy and had a crap ton of insecurities. Anyways, my friend was in mid-sentence. I don't think I even looked at him and told him something like, I gotta go. So I'd go over there and say, hi, you look bored. At first he gave me a look, like I was being annoying or something. It was just a glance my way. He does a double take and the biggest smile lights up his face. The weird part, apparently he had seen me first. His friend thought he knew me. He did, but not in the way he thought. The whole reason he was outside was to get introduced to me, so very surprising when I came up to him first. We got together 2 weeks later and have been together ever since. Story 29, I have 2. So first off, I met my oldest current friend when we were 14. When we were 17, we discovered we were born 3 hours apart. I demanded to see my ID because I thought someone was playing a joke on me. Seriously, I made my friend show ID to prove it. It took us 3 years to figure that out. Secondly, I ran into my cousin in California at an airport. Neither of us were flying home. We hadn't even spoken in weeks, but we had layovers at the same time at terminals that were right next to one another in a different state. It was so weird. We took a picture to prove it happened. Story 30. When I was a baby, I was given up for adoption by my mother. She had a 10-year-old son and was going through a very rough patch in her life. Fast forward 20 years, I'm a junior in college. I'd never known anything about my birth family except for the first names of my brother and mother. Never even seen a picture of them. Anyway, my adoptive mom bought me an Ancestry DNA test kit for Christmas. When I got my results back, my number one match was this guy named Vincent. I looked him up on Facebook and thought, damn, this guy looks like me. I sent him a message explaining everything and he instantly knew that I was his brother. This isn't the coincidental part. After talking for a bit through Messenger, we realized we only lived 10 minutes apart. We decided to meet that night and reconnect. Turns out we both attend the same university, have the same major and minor. He decided to go back to school and finish his degree 10 years later and happened to choose my university. All this time we thought we were across the country from each other. Nurture. We have a great relationship now, and it's amazing to have an older brother. Also, I found out I have a younger brother on my mother's side and another older brother on my biological father's side. Story 31. A few years back, my dad went on a trip to Denmark for a business trip. My mom, being Danish, decided that she was going to come along, that anyone in America was never found to adopt a family. But she had no idea where they lived or if any of them were still around. Anyway, after a week in the country, my mom and dad were driving down a country road when their car got flat. There wasn't really any cell reception, so they actually wound up walking up a driveway a bit to ask the locals to use their phone. They walk up the steps of this little cottage, knock on the door, and an elderly woman comes to the door. Her eyes lit up, fixed on my mom, and wound up giving her a hug. My parents were understandably confused as the old woman's husband was also excited to see my mom. The couple didn't really speak any English, but they led my parents down the main hallway to their guest room. There, on the dresser, was a photo of my mom and her brothers from their high school graduation. The old couple were my mother's great aunt and uncle, the ones that never came to the USA. To this day, my parents still can't explain it. Story 32. Oh man, I to this day am amazed by this. I was in the process of moving to France for school and needed to get a visa from the consultant in Chicago, 6 hours from my hometown. So I go there and my dad drops me off at the building. However, during the appointment, I realized I had forgotten a piece of paperwork. Now the woman working says I will leave to go get it. I'll have to reschedule the entire appointment, but if my dad brings it up, that's fine. So I go to call him, and at that moment I realize my phone has completely stopped working. Like dead as dead can get. So I sheepishly ask a girl about my age to sit in the lobby if I can use hers. She says yes, and to my surprise, her case is the logo for my university. Turns out we go to the same school, and she's getting a visa for another city in France. I thank her for talking to her about some professors, and then my dad shows up and I finish my appointment. But here's where crap gets insane. 1 year later, I'm moving back home from France. I had bought a business class seat because WoW Air sucks for long flights otherwise. I notice a girl looking very puzzled at me 2 rows behind me, and she looks very familiar. Everyone gets off the plane and she comes up to me and asks if I remember her. Then it hit me. It was the same girl from the consulate. She had extended her stay in France. We both have a good laugh about the odds of that happening. Story 33. My mom and I went to England in 2016 for the first time. We were on the top tier of a double-decker bus. I was sitting in the back, Mom was sitting in the front. She struck up a conversation with the lady in the next seat. Turns out she taught at my high school in NC. I never had her. I was a band person. She taught home ec, so her class was never available to me, but she was there while I was. And next day we were standing in line at the Tower of London. Mom strikes up a conversation with the Americans in front of us. Turns out they also lived in our small town for a while, Elizabeth City, and his son, also with him, went to Sheep Harney Elementary, where my youngest sister went. Would not have been there when she was. Small world. Story 34, I have 2. The first was in Mexico when I was 16. At the resort, there is a spot to paint pottery, and I was there with my dad, who was sitting across from me. Next to us was another father and his daughter. They were both from our hometown. I asked the daughter what high school she went to, and it turned out to be the high school my recent ex went to. It turns out she did. She is his girlfriend. It was crazy, and we both thought it was so cool. Meanwhile, our dads are finding it so strange and were confused why an ex and a current girlfriend were excited to meet each other. The second coincidence was at my work. One of my coworkers was my same age, and it turns out his birthday was 2 days before mine. I asked him where he was born. He was born at a military hospital in Oklahoma, the hospital I was born at. We were both in the same hospital, the same nursery, just feet away from each other. It was one of the coolest moments in my life. Story 35. I spent a few months living in the south of Spain last year doing a teaching internship. Prior to this, I had taught in my hometown in the UK and given some one-to-one tutoring sessions to students learning English as a foreign language. One of my students was a really cool Spanish dude who had moved to the UK to work and improve his English. I taught him for about a year and we became friends and got on really well. Eventually, he moved back to his hometown in central Spain, and unfortunately, we didn't keep in touch much and didn't hear from him that often. Fast forward a year or so, and I move out to Spain for this internship. One day I was sitting with a friend in a local park on a lovely Spanish sunny day having coffee and breakfast when I glanced across to the main gate of the park and saw my former student walking in with a friend. We both saw each other, did a double take, and ran up to each other shouting, "What are you doing here?" Turns out the friend he was with was from the city we were in, and he was visiting him for the weekend. Probably the strangest thing ever was that he had decided to visit this city I was living in and had decided to go to the same park at the same time I was there, and us bumping into each other after not having seen each other in a year in a different country.